I thought my parents left me nothing but a broken, worthless table. But the night I found the hidden compartment, everything changed. Hi, I'm Harper, and what started as a painful reminder of being forgotten turned into the discovery of a lifetime. Buried inside that table was a secret no one ever told me, a legacy almost lost to time. Have you ever uncovered something that made you question everything you thought you knew? Share your story or your thoughts below. I'd love to hear if you've ever found hidden treasures in the most unexpected places. They didn't say goodbye. They left a table instead, a table I never wanted. When I opened the door to my apartment that afternoon, the heavy, sour-sweet scent of aged pine hit me before I even noticed what was waiting. Right there, squatting awkwardly in the center of my small living room, was a battered wooden table, legs askew, surface scuffed from years of careless use. A piece of masking tape clung to the top edge, curling at the corners. On it, in my father's hurried handwriting, "Yours." I dropped my bag on the floor with a soft thud. The cicadas buzzed lazily outside the cracked window, their hum mixing with the low, steady throb of distant traffic. Inside, the apartment felt heavier now, weighed down by that thing. I kicked off my shoes, toes curling into the cool hardwood, and just stared. They hadn't called. They hadn't even texted to warn me. After selling the old family house, they packed what mattered to them and left behind what didn't. Like me, I supposed. And now, apparently, like this table. A flicker of memory rose unbidden. Granddad's voice, warm and steady, echoing from some forgotten summer afternoon. "Real treasures don't announce themselves, Harp," he used to say. "You gotta look twice, maybe 3 times. Back then, I believed him. Back then, I thought everything old had magic tucked inside if you squinted hard enough. I shook the thought away. There was no magic here, just bad varnish and the weight of being forgotten. The table looked even worse up close. Thick legs that were trying too hard to look elegant, a surface warped slightly from heat or maybe neglect. I knelt beside it, running my fingers along the edge almost without thinking. The wood felt rough and sticky under my touch, like regret. My stomach twisted. I thought about all those dinners growing up, sitting stiffly around this very table. My ideas about painting classes, traveling after college, or working at an art co-op brushed off like crumbs from my father's impeccable blazer. Mom would just smile tightly, sipping her iced tea, her eyes somewhere far away. They never yelled. They didn't have to. Their silence said enough. I stood, the muscles in my back tightening as if bracing against the weight of those old ghosts. Determined, I grabbed one corner of the table and started dragging it toward the far wall, planning to shove it somewhere out of sight until I could figure out what to do with it. The table scraped loudly against the floor, making me wince. Halfway across the room, my hand slipped against one of the carved legs. I jerked back instinctively, expecting a splinter. Instead, my fingers found something odd, a groove, shallow but deliberate, running beneath the finish like a secret whisper just out of reach. I frowned and bent closer, brushing away a thin layer of dust. The light from the window caught on the surface, revealing a faint pattern I hadn't noticed before. Not just random nicks from wear and tear. These were markings. Small, careful carvings, almost invisible unless you were looking for them. The cicadas buzzed louder, or maybe it just felt that way. My pulse thudded in my ears. It was probably nothing. A bored woodworker's flourish, a trick of old varnish and my overactive imagination. Still, I couldn't pull my hand away. I leaned in, letting my fingers trace the delicate lines. Circles nested inside each other, lines connecting at strange, deliberate angles, almost like a map or a code. The air around me seemed to thicken, as if the room itself was holding its breath. For the first time since I found that cursed table sitting in my apartment, I felt something unfamiliar stirring in my chest. Not anger, not sadness. Something electric, humming just beneath my ribs. I sat back on my heels, eyes fixed on the carvings, as if they might rearrange themselves into something I could read if I stared long enough. I thought it was just old wood, I whispered into the stillness. Now I wasn't so sure. Most people wouldn't have noticed. Most people weren't me. The rain started just after midnight, soft and insistent, drumming against the windows like an old lullaby played out of tune. I sat cross-legged on the living room floor, a flashlight balanced between my knees, the battered table looming in front of me like a challenge issued in silence. I should have been asleep hours ago, but every time I closed my eyes, all I could see were those strange carvings, the way they seemed to shift when the light caught them just right. I couldn't explain it, but something about that table refused to let me go. The room smelled like rain-soaked wood and dust, heavy and a little metallic. I pulled my sweatshirt tighter around my shoulders and clicked the flashlight on, the narrow beam slicing through the shadows. I angled the light beneath the table, letting it sweep slowly across the underside. There, again, the carvings, faint but deliberate. My fingers, still smudged with the faint grit of old varnish, traced the edges. And then I saw it. A seam, thin as a strand of hair, running along one of the thicker support beams. I leaned closer, heart beginning to drum a little faster. The seam wasn't natural. It was too straight, too precise, hidden beneath layers of grime and wear. I pressed lightly against it with my thumb. It didn't budge, but something about it called to me. A flash of memory surfaced, sharp and unexpected. Freshman year of college. A busted jewelry box from a yard sale. I'd spent hours picking at it, convinced there was more to it than met the eye. Everyone else had laughed, told me to toss it. But inside, under the false bottom, I'd found an old photograph of a woman in a faded dress, her face set in proud defiance. Small flaws tell the biggest stories, my art restoration professor had said once, tapping the frame with a knowing smile. Maybe he was right. Maybe flaws weren't accidents at all. I set the flashlight down and rummaged through the kitchen drawer for a butter knife. Not exactly the right tool, but it would have to do. I returned to the table, heart pounding louder than the rain. Carefully, I slid the knife's tip into the seam. Nothing happened at first. I adjusted the angle, prying gently, patient like I had learned restoring old canvases. Pressure could destroy what time had preserved. Slowly, so slowly, the wood shifted with a soft pop. A panel, no bigger than a paperback novel, swung outward, revealing a narrow compartment. For a long moment, I just stared. Inside, nestled against the splintered wood, was a tightly folded bundle of parchment, yellowed and brittle with age. My hands trembled slightly as I reached in, the old wood creaking under my movement. The parchment felt oddly warm against my skin, like it had been waiting for someone to find it. There was writing across the front in faded black ink. Property of W.S., 1913. I drew in a shaky breath. W.S.? 1913? None of it made sense, but one thing was clear. It wasn't random. It wasn't junk. Someone had hidden this on purpose, protected it inside a table no one would think twice about. Gently, I unfolded the parchment, careful not to tear the fragile fibers. It crackled softly in the stillness. The paper held diagrams, sketches of intricate joints, angles, designs too complicated to be simple blueprints. They looked like plans for something bigger, something more than a table. Rain pattered harder against the glass, a steady percussion that seemed to underline every heartbeat in my chest. I ran my fingers along the edges, feeling the slight ridges where the ink had been pressed into the page by a steady, determined hand. Whoever W.S. was, they had been meticulous, purposeful, like they had known that someday someone might need this. I leaned back against the couch, parchment spread across my lap, and stared out into the night. The streetlights flickered, casting the room in rhythmic pulses of light and shadow. I had spent most of my life feeling like a forgotten side note, an extra piece that didn't quite fit. And now, here I was, holding something that didn't fit either, something the world had overlooked, abandoned, left to rot. Until me. A soft chuckle escaped my lips, more breath than sound. Life had a funny way of hiding its real gifts in the places we least wanted to look. I pressed the parchment gently between the pages of an old art book to keep it safe. My hands were still trembling slightly as I moved, but it wasn't fear this time. It was something else. Hope, wonder, maybe even a little bit of belief. If this was what I thought it was, then nothing in my life was going to stay small anymore. Some names disappear for a reason, some because they were never given a chance. The next morning, the rain had slowed to a lazy drizzle, and the streets wore a thin mist like an old cardigan pulled snug against the chill. I tucked the parchment carefully into a manila folder, slipped on my boots, and headed downtown. It wasn't a long walk, but every step felt heavier than it should have. Maybe it was the weight of possibilities pressing down on me. Maybe it was the quiet hum of fear that I was about to find out none of it mattered, that I was chasing ghosts like my father always said I did. Ellis's store sat crammed between a shuttered bakery and a music shop that only sold vinyl. The sign out front had once been a cheerful navy blue, but now faded into a tired gray, the paint peeling at the corners. Hartwell's Rare Books, it read, the gold lettering barely hanging on. The bell over the door gave a stubborn clang as I pushed it open. The familiar musty smell of old paper and leather wrapped around me instantly, a scent so thick you could almost taste the dust on your tongue. It was a smell I loved, a smell that whispered secrets if you stayed long enough to listen. Ellis looked up from behind a leaning tower of books, his wiry frame almost blending into the chaos. His thick glasses perched precariously on the end of his nose, and his suspenders strained against a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. "Harper Dawson," he called, voice warm and scratchy like an old record. "It's been too long. Come to rescue me from an avalanche?" I smiled, grateful for the normalcy. "Not today, Ellis. I need your eyes." He chuckled, waving me over to the battered oak counter. I carefully set the folder down, my fingers lingering on the edge before pulling it open. "I found something," I said, almost apologetically, "in an old table my parents left behind." Ellis adjusted his glasses, peering down at the parchment with a low whistle. "Well now," he murmured, tracing the ink with a gnarled finger. "Property of W.S., 1913. Interesting." "You recognize it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual, but it came out thinner than I liked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he disappeared behind a stack of atlases and reemerged with a thick, battered volume that looked like it could double as a doorstop. "William Stanton," he said, thumbing through the pages with surprising dexterity. "Woodworker, artisan, ghost mostly." I leaned in, heart hammering against my ribs. "Ghost?" Ellis nodded. "His work pops up now and then. Pieces nobody can trace properly, no signatures, no records, just stories. Most collectors think they're myths, but a few of us know better." He turned the book toward me, pointing to a faded photograph of a table almost identical in style to mine. Thick legs, intricate inlays, that same sense of quiet defiance. "Stanton didn't believe in selling to the rich," Ellis said, his voice softening. "He made things for regular people, built to last, built to live with. He didn't want his work to become trophies." I touched the edge of the photo lightly, the paper cool under my fingertips. "But if my table is really one of his—" I trailed off, the thought too big to say aloud. Ellis leaned closer, dropping his voice to a near whisper. "Harper, if that table is real, it's not just old, it's priceless." The word hung between us, heavier than the mist outside, heavier than the air in my chest. I sank onto one of the mismatched chairs by the counter, suddenly light-headed. Priceless. A table I almost shoved into storage without a second thought. A piece of someone's forgotten brilliance, sitting unnoticed for who knows how long. And somehow, It had found its way to me. Ellis closed the book gently, folding his hands over the battered cover. "You've got a choice now," he said, watching me over the rims of his glasses. "Keep it hidden, safe, or bring it back into the light where it belongs." I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure I could. Outside, the drizzle thickened into a soft rain again, tapping against the grimy front window in a slow, patient rhythm. The kind of rain that sinks into the earth, not just washes over it. Lost stories have a way of finding the right people. Ellis had once told me years ago when I found a first edition tucked behind a radiator in his shop. Maybe this story had found me too. I tucked the parchment back into its folder with careful hands. My mind was racing, filled with 1,000 possibilities and 1,000 fears. And suddenly the thing I thought was worthless might just be the most important thing I ever owned. Some things are easier to hide, but some refuse to stay buried. The morning sky hung low over Asheville, swollen and heavy with clouds the color of old wool. Cold seeped through the cracks around the windows, making the apartment feel smaller, closer somehow. I pulled a blanket tighter around my shoulders and stared at the laptop screen, blinking back the exhaustion that hadn't really lifted since yesterday. The cursor blinked, patient and mocking, in the empty email draft. "Dear Asheville Art Center." Delete. "Dear Curatorial Team." Delete. "To whom it may concern." Delete. Each word felt wrong, too formal, too desperate, too ridiculous. Who was I to claim I had something worth their time? Just a nobody with a battered table and a handful of dreams she had no business still carrying around. I pushed the laptop away and rubbed my hands over my face. Notes and photocopies littered the coffee table in front of me, overlapping museum brochures, articles on American craftsmen, and a tangle of scribbled thoughts that no longer made any coherent sense. The rain had stopped some time before dawn, but the air was still damp, clinging to the glass and the walls like old regrets. I thought about the parchment tucked safely away in my bedroom drawer, about the table still waiting silently in the corner of the living room, its carvings catching the weak morning light like a whisper trying to break free. I thought about Ellis, the way he'd looked at me over the rims of his glasses, his voice steady even when he spoke of fragile things. "Truth has sharp edges, Harper. Handle it carefully." I pulled out my phone before I could talk myself out of it and found his number. The line clicked twice before his familiar voice answered, rough around the edges but warm like a worn quilt. "Harper, morning." Or, "What's left of it?" I smiled despite myself. "Hey, Ellis." He heard the hesitation, sharp as a crack in glass. "Tell me." I closed my eyes, letting the words tumble out before they could curdle. What if I'm just chasing a fantasy? What if it's nothing? What if I'm making a fool of myself? There was a pause on the line, but not the kind that came from uncertainty. It was the kind that came from choosing the right weight for the right words. "Some fantasies," Ellis said finally, "are real if you're brave enough to prove it." The words landed soft but firm, settling into a place inside me that had been hollow for longer than I cared to admit. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Thanks, Ellis." "You already know what you need to do," he said, voice gentler now. "You're just scared." I was. I was terrified. But maybe fear wasn't the worst thing. Maybe it meant I was standing on the edge of something worth crossing. I hung up, the dial tone buzzing for a second before the apartment fell back into its quiet gray hum. I pulled the laptop back toward me, cracked my knuckles, a nervous habit I never quite broke, and started typing. This time, I didn't delete it. Subject: Inquiry regarding historical furniture piece. Body: Dear Asheville Art Center, I recently came into possession of a table bearing markings and construction techniques consistent with early 20th century artisan William Stanton. Enclosed are preliminary photographs and notes. I would be grateful for an opportunity to discuss the possibility of authentication. Thank you for your time and consideration. Sincerely, Harper Dawson. I hovered over the send button for a full 30 seconds. long enough to question everything, long enough to want to walk away. But then I thought about the table, about the secret it had carried all these years, waiting patiently for someone to notice, waiting for someone to care. My finger pressed down. The email zipped off into the digital ether with a quiet, decisive sound. Too late now to call it back. I closed the laptop with a soft thud and let my head fall back against the worn couch cushion. The apartment smelled faintly of rain-soaked books and stale coffee, the kind of scent that clings to a place long after the storm has passed. Maybe it wasn't the grand, cinematic leap of faith people talked about. Maybe sometimes bravery was just hitting send and breathing through the panic that followed. I let my eyes drift closed, the exhaustion pulling me down like a warm tide. I told myself not to expect anything. Not today, not ever. But life, it seems, doesn't always wait for permission. The buzz of my phone on the table jolted me upright. I grabbed it, heart thudding hard enough to hurt. New email from Dr. Samuel Layton, curator, Asheville Art Center. I swallowed hard and clicked it open. Dear Ms. Dawson, thank you for reaching out. Your preliminary photographs are highly intriguing. We would very much like to examine the piece in person. Could you be available for a consultation this coming week? I read it once, twice. The words didn't change. They wanted to see it. They were taking me seriously. I sat very still, the phone cradled in both hands, as if moving too fast might shatter the fragile, impossible thing I was holding. I had opened the door. Now there was no closing it. News spreads faster than the truth ever could. By the time I pulled up outside my parents' house, my palms were damp against the steering wheel. Spring had come late to Asheville that year, and the air still carried a biting edge, slicing through the pale sunshine that barely warmed the cracked sidewalks. The Dawson house sat hunched behind a tangle of overgrown hedges, its once proud white paint now dulled to a weary gray. The for sale sign that had once stood proudly in the yard was gone, replaced by silence and sagging porch steps. I sat there for a long moment, engine ticking as it cooled, gathering the kind of courage that doesn't come from pep talks or deep breaths. It comes from knowing you have to walk through a fire, whether you're ready or not. I thought of my mother's old saying, the one she used to mutter when arguments swirled too close. Don't stir the pot unless you're ready to eat what's inside. Well, here I was, spoon in hand. I tucked the folder under my arm and climbed the steps. My knock echoed sharp against the hollow door. After a few long seconds, Margaret opened it, her sweater sagging at the elbows, her hair pulled back too tightly. "Harper," she said, blinking like I'd materialized from the mist. "Hey, Mom." My voice cracked slightly. "Is Dad home?" She hesitated, then nodded and stepped aside. The house smelled the same. Old coffee, lemon polish, and something sour underneath, like disappointment soaked into the walls. Most of the furniture was gone, leaving bare spots in the carpet where heavy things once sat. Memories clung to the empty spaces like dust. Walter sat at the kitchen table, a newspaper folded neatly in front of him, a cup of coffee cooling untouched at his elbow. He didn't look up when I entered. I set the folder down on the counter with a soft thump. "I need to talk to you." That got his attention. He peered over the rim of his glasses, face already drawn tight with suspicion. "I found something," I said, forcing the words out steadily. "Something important about the table you left me." Walter's mouth twisted into something that might have been a smirk if it had any real energy behind it. "You're dreaming, Harper. Always have been." I clenched my hands into fists at my sides, nails biting into my palms. "Just look." I opened the folder, sliding out the museum's preliminary authentication. Official letterhead, phrases like significant historical artifact and preliminary confirmation of William Stanton craftsmanship practically shouted off the page. Margaret hovered near the sink, wringing a dish rag between her hands like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the room. Walter read the first few lines, his eyebrows inching higher. Then he shoved the paper away like it had burned him. "You think this means something?" he barked, voice sharp enough to crack porcelain. "You think parading this around makes you important?" My breath caught. "That's not what this is about." His chair scraped harshly against the floor as he stood, towering over me in that way that once made me shrink without thinking. "You're embarrassing yourself and us," he snapped, "dragging up old junk, making it into some fairy tale. You always did have a gift for wasting time." Each word landed like a slap, not unexpected, but still somehow worse, because I saw the fear behind them. Fear that I might be right, that I might have found something valuable in the very thing they threw away without a second glance. I steadied myself against the counter, my knees trembling. For a moment, I almost backed down. The urge to apologize, to smooth things over, rose like a reflex so old it wore my shape. But I thought of that table, of the carvings hidden just out of sight, of the parchment folded carefully by hands that believed someone, someday, might understand. I straightened my spine, my voice low but unwavering. "You didn't see its value," I said, each word carefully placed, like stones across a river I was determined to cross. "That doesn't mean it wasn't there." Walter's face flushed dark red, his mouth opening and closing without words. Margaret turned away, her shoulders hunching as if trying to disappear into the faded wallpaper. I gathered the papers back into the folder with shaking hands. The metallic taste of fear still lingered on my tongue, but underneath it, something new was blooming, something like freedom. I didn't wait for permission or forgiveness. I didn't need either. I turned and walked toward the door, the old floorboards creaking under my steps like a chorus of weary goodbyes. Maybe they would never see what I saw. Maybe they couldn't. But for the first time, I realized it didn't matter. Maybe they never would see. But I finally could. The old table still sat by the window, bathed in soft afternoon light, no longer just a piece of forgotten wood, but a witness to the truths I'd finally dared to see. In its quiet way, it had taught me that not everything valuable shouts to be noticed. Some things simply wait for the right eyes to find them. Sometimes we inherit more than objects. We inherit the chance to choose differently, to honor what others discarded. It's easy to overlook quiet beauty or unseen worth, but if we listen carefully, the past still speaks to those willing to hear. If this story touched something in your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to share your own memories or reflections, because every forgotten table, every hidden story deserves a second chance to shine.